The porch light flickered against the darkness like a dying heartbeat, casting unsteady shadows across the weathered deck of the cabin. I can still hear the sound of those beer bottles clinking together, the hollow percussion of glass against glass as we passed them around the circle. The air smelled of pine and lake water, that particular dampness that clings to your clothes and follows you home long after the weekend ends. We were too old for this. That thought crossed my mind more than once as I sat there among faces I'd known since high school. Men approaching 40 who still gathered like boys plotting mischief. The cheap whiskey burned in small glasses we'd found in the cabin's kitchen, mismatched remnants left behind by previous renters. Someone had brought cards. Someone always brought cards. The game itself didn't matter. 5-card stud, maybe, or something we'd half remembered and bastardized with house rules that made no sense. What mattered was the ritual, the excuse to sit close together in that golden pool of light while the lake stretched black and infinite beyond the railing. What mattered was the laughter that came easier with each round, the way we fell back into old rhythms as if the years between had never happened. I should have been thinking about home, about Vanessa waiting in our bedroom, probably asleep by now with a book splayed across her chest, about the kids and their Monday morning routines, the lunches I'd need to pack, and the permission slips I'd forgotten to sign. Instead, I found myself watching Julian's hands as he dealt the cards, the same careful precision he'd had when we were 17 and he'd taught me to roll cigarettes behind the gymnasium. The dare tradition started in high school. Loser does a dare. Simple as that. Childish, maybe, but it had carried us through 2 decades of friendship, becoming the punctuation mark at the end of every gathering. Usually it was harmless. Sing a song, call an ex-girlfriend, jump in the lake fully clothed. The kind of stupid courage that came from peer pressure and alcohol and the safety of knowing everyone would laugh with you, not at you. When my cards fell wrong that night, when the final hand left me holding nothing but a pair of 3s and a sheepish grin, I expected the usual ceremony. The mock deliberation, the theatrical groaning about what embarrassing task they'd dream up. But Julian looked across the table at me with something different in his eyes. Something that made the laughter around us fade to white noise. He said loser has to do a dare, but he said it quietly, his voice cutting through the chatter like a blade through silk. The others didn't seem to notice the change in his tone, the way his gaze held mine a beat too long. They were already suggesting ridiculous challenges, their voices overlapping in a chorus of drunken creativity. But I noticed. I felt it in my chest first, a tightness that had nothing to do with losing the hand and everything to do with the gravity in Julian's expression. There was recognition there, something unspoken passing between us in the space of that look, as if he were seeing straight through the careful architecture of my adult life, past the wedding ring and the mortgage and the practiced smile I wore at parent-teacher conferences. The moment stretched longer than it should have, longer than made sense for a simple card game among old friends. I could feel my pulse in my throat, could taste copper on my tongue. Around us, the night sound seemed amplified. The gentle lap of water against the dock, the distant call of a loon across the lake, the whisper of wind through pine branches. Something was opening inside me that I'd kept locked for so long I'd almost forgotten it existed. Some door I'd painted over and plastered shut, convinced I'd never need to use it again. But Julian's look was a key I'd never thrown away, and suddenly I could feel the hinges groaning under pressure I pretended wasn't there. The others were still laughing, still shouting suggestions for my dare, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. In that suspended moment, there was only Julian and the weight of what he wasn't saying, the question he was asking without words. The challenge that had nothing to do with jumping in cold water or singing off-key songs. I swallowed hard, tasting whiskey and fear in equal measure, and felt the first crack in the foundation I'd spent 15 years building. The drive home from the cabin took 4 hours, but I wished it could have lasted longer. There's something about highway driving in the early morning that makes you feel suspended between worlds, neither fully in the place you've left nor quite arrived at the one waiting for you. The rental car smelled like stale beer and someone's cologne, and Julian's laughter still echoed in my ears even as the miles stretched between us. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was painting the suburban street in soft gold. My house looked exactly as I'd left it 2 days before. Same mailbox tilting slightly to the left. Same crack in the front walkway that I'd been meaning to fix for 3 years. Same carefully maintained lawn that was Vanessa's pride and the neighborhood standard. Everything in its place, exactly as it should be. Inside, the silence felt different than it had before I'd left. Heavier, maybe. More noticeable. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the soft tick of the grandfather clock my mother-in-law had given us for our 10th anniversary. Vanessa was still asleep upstairs, her breathing steady and predictable. The kids wouldn't wake for another hour, giving me time to shower off the weekend and slip back into the rhythm of Monday morning. This was my life. Insurance claims and soccer practice schedules, mortgage payments and parent-teacher conferences. I worked downtown in a building that looked like every other office building, processing paperwork for people who'd had their small disasters covered by policies they hoped they'd never need to use. Steady work. Reliable income. The kind of job that let you sleep at night knowing you could pay for braces and college funds and the 1,000 small emergencies that come with raising children. Our kitchen table bore the scars of 15 years of family meals. Crayon marks from when Emma was 4, a water ring from the time David left a sweating glass there overnight, a small burn mark from the morning Vanessa set a hot pot down without thinking. The refrigerator was covered in school schedules and grocery lists, permission slips, and family photos held up by magnets shaped like fruit. We looked happy in those photos. Vanessa and I flanking the kids at various ages, all of us smiling in that careful way people do for cameras. Beach vacations and birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and first days of school. The documentation of a life lived according to plan, each milestone checked off like items on a list someone else had written. But there were spaces between us and those pictures, I realized. Subtle gaps that had grown wider over the years without either of us acknowledging them. The way Vanessa's smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. The way I always seemed to be looking slightly away from the camera, as if searching for something just beyond the frame. We slept in the same bed, but faced opposite walls more nights than not. Not from anger or any dramatic falling out, but from the quiet erosion that happens when two people slowly become strangers sharing a mortgage. She had her routines, I had mine. She watched her shows, I read my books. We moved around each other in the mornings like careful dancers, never quite colliding, never quite touching. The children filled the spaces where conversation used to be. Emma's piano recitals and David's baseball games became the shared language we spoke, the common ground we could stand on safely. We were good parents, Vanessa and I, attentive and involved, present at every school function. But somewhere in the process of building this life together, we'd forgotten how to be anything else to each other. Julian and I had met in high school, back when the future felt like an ocean of possibilities stretching out before us. He played soccer with a reckless grace that made coaches simultaneously proud and terrified. I was quieter then, the kind of kid who did well in school and followed rules, but Julian brought out something wilder in me. He made me laugh until my stomach ached, convinced me to skip classes I'd never missed before, taught me that breaking small rules could feel like flying. College had scattered us in different directions, but we'd managed to stay connected through late-night phone calls and holiday visits home. There had been road trips during summer breaks, camping expeditions that lasted until dawn, nights spent talking about everything and nothing while music played from someone's car stereo. Julian moved through those years like he moved through everything else, with an ease I envied and never quite understood. Adulthood had pulled us apart more gradually. Different cities, different careers, the consuming demands of building separate lives. We'd stayed in touch through Christmas cards and social media, the occasional text message on birthdays. But the reunion weekend had been our first real time together in years, and being around him again had reminded me of who I used to be before I became who I was supposed to be. The cabin had felt like a different world entirely. No cell service, no schedules to keep, nothing but the lake and the woods and time stretching out like we were 20 again. Julian had moved through that space with the same confidence he'd always had, starting the fire on the first try, knowing which beer everyone preferred, telling stories that made us all remember why we'd been friends in the first place. There had been moments during those 2 days when I caught myself watching him more carefully than I should have. The way he threw his head back when he laughed, the casual strength in his hands as he dealt cards or opened bottles, the way the firelight caught the silver that was just starting to thread through his hair. I'd pushed those observations away as quickly as they came, filing them under the safe category of nostalgia, old friendship, the harmless appreciation one man can have for another. But that look he'd given me during the card game wouldn't be filed away so easily. It lingered in my memory like smoke, curling around the edges of everything else I tried to think about. Even now, standing in my own kitchen making coffee in the quiet before my family woke up, I could feel the weight of his gaze, the unspoken question that had passed between us in that moment. I told myself it had been nothing. Too much whiskey and the strange intimacy that comes from being away from real life, removed from consequences. But my hands shook slightly as I measured the coffee grounds, and I knew I was lying to myself in the way I'd become expert at over the years. The same way I lied when I told myself I was happy, when I said I had everything a man could want, when I pretended that the hollow feeling in my chest was just the normal weight of adult responsibility. Upstairs, Vanessa's alarm would ring soon, and the day would begin in earnest. Breakfast and backpacks, carpools and conference calls, the familiar machinery of our shared life grinding back into motion. But for these few stolen minutes in the early morning silence, I allowed myself to remember how it felt to laugh until my ribs hurt, to sit around a fire with people who'd known me before I became careful, to meet the eyes of someone who seemed to see straight through to the person I'd left behind somewhere along the way. The weeks that followed felt like living underwater. I moved through my days with the strange disconnection that comes from pretending everything is normal when something fundamental has shifted beneath the surface. At breakfast, Vanessa would ask if I was feeling all right, noting that I seemed distracted. I'd blame work stress or a lingering cold, anything that didn't require me to explain the way Julian's look had lodged itself somewhere behind my ribcage like a splinter I couldn't reach. I tried to settle back into routine. Insurance claims and grocery runs, homework help and bedtime stories. But my mind kept drifting back to that porch light flickering against the darkness, to the weight of recognition in Julian's eyes, to the feeling that something had been spoken without words. I found myself checking my phone more often than I should have, though I couldn't have said what I was hoping to find there. Work became a refuge of sorts. Numbers didn't lie or carry hidden meanings. Actuarial tables were mercifully straightforward. When Mrs. Henderson called about her flooded basement or Mr. Torres needed documentation for his fender bender, their problems had clear parameters and predictable solutions. I could lose myself in the mechanical process of assessment and payment, in the comfortable fiction that all of life's disasters could be quantified and covered by the right policy. But even there, my concentration would slip. I'd find myself staring out the office window at the street below, watching people walk past with their own secret burdens, their own questions they'd never learned to ask. I wondered how many of them were living the lives they'd planned versus the lives they'd settled for. How many were carrying the weight of words they'd never spoken? The text arrived on a Thursday evening while I was helping David with his math homework. The buzz of my phone was unremarkable, lost in the familiar chaos of family dinner cleanup and weekend planning. It wasn't until later, after the dishes were done and the kids were settled in front of the television, that I saw Julian's name on the screen. "Hey, we should grab a drink sometime. Just us." 7 words that somehow managed to stop my breath entirely. I stared at the message for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, cycling through a dozen responses I couldn't bring myself to send. Part of me wanted to delete the message, to pretend it had never arrived. The safer part, the part that understood that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. But there was another part of me, quieter but insistent, that had been waiting for this message without knowing it. The part that remembered what it felt like to laugh until my sides hurt, to feel fully present in my own life instead of watching it happen to someone else. The part that recognized Julian's invitation for what it really was, even if I wasn't ready to name it yet. I told Vanessa I had a client dinner downtown. The lie came easier than it should have, sliding off my tongue like I'd been practicing it for years. She barely looked up from her magazine, just reminded me to be careful driving home if I'd been drinking. The casual way she dismissed my evening out should have felt like freedom, but instead it highlighted the distance that had grown between us, the way we'd stopped being curious about each other's inner lives. The bar Julian had chosen was the kind of place that existed in the spaces between more important destinations. Not quite a dive, not trying to be anything fancy. Just dim lighting and worn wooden tables. The comfortable anonymity that comes from being somewhere no one you know is likely to wander into by accident. It was perfect for conversations you didn't want to have in brighter places. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with 2 glasses of something amber already waiting. He looked up when I walked in, that same easy smile I remembered from high school spreading across his face. And for a moment it was like no time had passed at all. Like we were still 17 and the world was still full of possibilities we hadn't learned to be afraid of yet. We talked about safe things at first. Work and weather, mutual friends, and shared memories that felt harmless in the retelling. But Julian listened with an intensity that made ordinary conversation feel charged with meaning. He remembered details I'd forgotten I'd ever told anyone. The way I used to bite my nails during soccer games when we were kids. The fact that I'd wanted to be a writer before practical concerns steered me toward insurance. The summer I'd worked at the ice cream shop and came home every night smelling like vanilla and disappointment. He remembered things about me that I'd stopped remembering about myself. When he laughed, it was the same sound that had followed me home from the cabin, rich and genuine in a way that made me realize how rarely I heard real laughter anymore. The careful, measured responses of parent-teacher conferences and office meetings had replaced the kind of unguarded joy that used to punctuate my days. With Julian, I felt myself relaxing into a version of myself I'd thought was gone forever. But underneath the easy conversation, something else was building. A tension that had nothing to do with nostalgia and everything to do with the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The way our knees would brush under the small table and neither of us would move away. The way silence would stretch between us, not awkward but heavy with possibility, until one of us would find something safe to say to break the spell. When he suggested we do this again soon, I heard myself agreeing before my rational mind could intervene. Yes, I said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As if I weren't a married man with 2 children and a mortgage. As if I had every right to carve secret hours out of my carefully constructed life. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and second-guessing. I kept replaying moments from the evening, searching for signs I'd misread or boundaries I'd crossed without realizing it. But even my guilt felt different than it should have. Less like shame and more like anticipation, as if I were finally moving towards something instead of away from it. The second meeting happened the following week. Then a third. Each time, Julian would text with casual suggestions that felt anything but casual. A different bar, a different excuse for Vanessa, but the same electric undercurrent that made ordinary conversation feel like code for something neither of us was ready to speak aloud. I became expert at justifying these evenings to myself. Old friendship, harmless nostalgia, the normal desire to maintain connections with people who'd known you in your youth. But my hands would shake slightly when Julian's name appeared on my phone, and I'd find myself spending too long choosing what to wear, as if these were dates I was preparing for instead of casual drinks between old friends. Julian never named what was happening between us. He was too careful for that, too aware of what words could do once they were spoken. But he didn't need to name it. It was there in the way he'd lean forward when I talked, giving me his complete attention in a way that felt both flattering and dangerous. It was there in the stories he chose to tell, memories that painted us as closer than I'd remembered being, moments that felt deliberately chosen to remind me of who we'd once been together. The air between us grew thicker with each meeting, charged with the weight of things we weren't saying. We were both married men, both fathers, both people with lives that had no room for the electricity that sparked every time our eyes met across a table. But knowing something is impossible has never been the same as not wanting it. and I was beginning to understand that wanting something badly enough could reshape the geography of what seemed possible. I started looking forward to his texts with an intensity that scared me. Each message felt like a secret gift, a reminder that somewhere in my carefully ordered life, there was still room for surprise, for the kind of connection that made you feel fully alive instead of just going through the motions. I was playing with fire, and I knew it. But after years of feeling like I was sleepwalking through my own life, the heat felt like coming back to consciousness. The strain of living in two worlds began to show in ways I couldn't control. At breakfast, I'd catch Vanessa watching me with a question in her eyes that she never quite asked. She'd comment that I seemed distant lately, that I was working late more often than usual. Her tone was careful, probing without demanding, the way you might test ice before stepping onto a frozen pond. "Are you feeling all right?" she'd ask, and I'd blame stress at work, a difficult case, anything that sounded plausible enough to explain why I moved through our house like a stranger visiting someone else's life. The lies accumulated like sediment, each one building on the last until I could barely remember what the truth looked like underneath. But with Julian, the lies fell away like old paint. In those dimly lit corners of forgettable bars, I became someone I'd thought was lost forever. Someone who could laugh without measuring the sound first, who could talk for hours without watching the clock or calculating how much attention I owed to other obligations. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Our meetings stretched later into the evening, as if neither of us wanted to return to the lives waiting for us outside those walls. Julian would order another round without asking, and I'd find myself nodding yes when every rational part of my mind knew I should be heading home. But rationality felt like a luxury I couldn't afford anymore, not when every conversation with him felt like oxygen after years of holding my breath. He had a gift for remembering things I'd forgotten I'd ever shared with anyone. Details from our youth that I'd filed away as unimportant, moments that had seemed insignificant at the time but took on new weight in the retelling. The way he reconstructed our shared history felt like archaeology, like he was carefully excavating pieces of who I used to be and presenting them back to me like artifacts from a civilization I'd abandoned. "Do you remember the spring formal our junior year?" he asked one evening, swirling the ice in his glass with one finger. "You wore your father's tie because you couldn't afford a new one, and you were convinced everyone would notice it was too wide for the fashion." I did remember, suddenly and with startling clarity. The nervous energy of getting dressed in my childhood bedroom, the way the tie felt like a costume from another era, the certainty that everyone would be able to tell I didn't belong in that gymnasium decorated with crepe paper and borrowed dreams. But Julian's version of the memory was different, more generous than my own. "You looked good," he said simply, and something in his tone made the words feel heavier than they should have. "I kept catching myself watching you dance with Sarah Mitchell, thinking how natural you looked out there, like you'd figured out some secret the rest of us were still trying to learn." The memory shifted in my chest, taking on dimensions I'd never noticed before. I'd been so focused on my own insecurities that night, so convinced I was playing a part badly, that I'd missed the possibility that someone else might be watching me with appreciation instead of judgment. The idea that Julian had been thinking about me in ways I'd never imagined felt both thrilling and terrifying. Then there was the road trip the summer before our senior year. 4 days driving to Colorado because Julian had convinced us we needed to see the mountains before we scattered to different colleges. I'd been worried about the cost, about missing shifts at my summer job, but Julian had a way of making impractical things seem not just possible, but essential. "You fell asleep on my shoulder somewhere in Kansas," he said, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper. "I was afraid to move for the rest of the drive because I didn't want to wake you up. You looked so peaceful, like you'd finally stopped worrying about everything for 5 minutes." I felt heat rise to my face, a flush of embarrassment mixed with something else I couldn't name. The memory was there, hazy around the edges, but real enough. The steady vibration of Julian's old Honda, the way exhaustion had finally overtaken my usual vigilance about personal space. I'd woken up hours later with a crick in my neck and Julian's shoulder warm beneath my cheek, and I'd been too drowsy and too grateful for the rest to feel awkward about it. But hearing Julian describe it now, 20 years later, I understood that he'd been paying attention to details I'd missed entirely. The care in his voice when he talked about not wanting to disturb me suggested the moment had meant something to him that it hadn't meant to me at the time. Or maybe it had meant something to me too, something I'd been too young or too afraid to acknowledge. The most vivid memory he brought up was from a night late in that same summer. A group of us had driven out to Miller's Lake for what was supposed to be a quick swim before heading home. But the water had been perfect, cool enough to be refreshing without being shocking, and the moon had been bright enough to light our way without needing flashlights. One by one, the others had gotten cold or bored or remembered they had early shifts the next morning. But Julian and I had stayed, floating on our backs in the middle of that small lake, talking about everything and nothing while the stars wheeled overhead. We'd stayed until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, until the practical concerns of the coming day finally outweighed the magic of that suspended moment. I'd forgotten how perfect that night had been, how it had felt like existing outside of time entirely. But Julian remembered every detail. The way the water had felt like silk against our skin, the conversation that had ranged from our deepest fears to our most ridiculous dreams, the way the sunrise had painted the lake's surface gold and pink and made us both go quiet with something that felt too large for words. "You said that night that you'd never felt so much like yourself," he told me, his eyes holding mine across the small table. "You said it felt like finally exhaling after holding your breath your whole life." I had said that. The memory came rushing back with startling intensity, along with the feeling that had prompted it. That sense of absolute rightness, of being exactly where I belonged with exactly the person I was meant to be with. I'd been 17 and naive enough to think that feeling was about the lake, about the night, about being young and free and full of possibility. Now, sitting in a bar 20 years later, I wondered if I'd been wrong about what that feeling was really about. Our laughter had a different quality during these conversations, deeper and more intimate than the easy camaraderie we'd shared at the cabin reunion. Sometimes Julian would say something that struck both of us as funny, and we'd dissolve into the kind of helpless giggling that made other patrons glance over with a mild annoyance reserved for people having more fun than they were. But underneath the laughter was something else, a current of recognition that made even the lightest moments feel charged with significance. It was during one of these conversations, late on a Tuesday evening when I should have been home hours earlier, that the laughter faded into something more dangerous. We'd been talking about our kids, the strange pride that comes from watching small humans develop their own personalities and preferences, when Julian's expression shifted. The easy smile disappeared, replaced by something more intense, more focused. He looked at me the way he had that night at the cabin, with that same steady, unblinking attention that made me feel simultaneously seen and exposed. The noise of the bar faded to background static. The space between us across the table felt both vast and non-existent, like we were separated by miles and touching at the same time. I knew that look wasn't friendly, wasn't casual, wasn't the kind of attention one old friend gives another while reminiscing about their shared past. It was an invitation, direct and unmistakable, to step across a line we'd been approaching for weeks without acknowledging it existed. My breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat, and I felt my heart begin to race with a mixture of panic and anticipation I hadn't experienced since I was a teenager. The moment stretched between us like a held note, beautiful and unsustainable. I could feel myself balanced on the edge of something that would change everything, could sense that whatever I did next would determine not just the rest of the evening, but the trajectory of everything that came after. Julian wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding a response, but his patience felt like its own kind of pressure. I stood up so abruptly that my chair scraped against the floor with an embarrassing screech. Mumbled something about it being late, about needing to get home. Julian nodded like he'd expected this, like he understood that some invitations are too large to accept on the first offering. But his eyes followed me as I fumbled for my wallet, as I left money on the table with shaking hands, as I walked toward the door without looking back. The walk to my car felt like a retreat from myself, like I was fleeing from some essential part of who I was in favor of the safer, smaller version I'd learned to be. My keys felt foreign in my hands, and I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes before starting the engine, trying to slow my breathing and convince myself that what had just happened was something I could pretend hadn't happened at all. But the drive home was filled with Julian's face, with the weight of his attention, with the terrible certainty that something fundamental had shifted between us whether I acknowledged it or not. I kept replaying that moment. The way his look had cut through all the careful pretense we'd maintained and spoken directly to something I'd spent years trying to ignore. At home, Vanessa was already asleep, her breathing steady and predictable in the darkness of our bedroom. I lay down beside her as quietly as possible, but sleep felt impossible. I stared at the ceiling, acutely aware of the space between our bodies, of how long it had been since we'd touched each other with anything approaching desire. I realized I was afraid, but not of Julian. Not of what he might want from me, or what he might ask me to become. I was afraid of what he represented. A truth that had been waiting patiently in the corners of my consciousness for 20 years, growing stronger with each birthday, each anniversary. Each night, I lay awake wondering why my life felt like a costume that no longer fit. The truth was that I'd been living as a visitor in my own existence, playing the role of husband and father and responsible adult, while some essential part of me remained locked away, waiting for permission to emerge. Julian's look had been an invitation, yes, but it had also been recognition. He'd seen the person I'd hidden even from myself, and he'd been offering me the chance to let that person breathe again. In the darkness of my bedroom, with my wife's gentle snoring filling the silence and my children sleeping safely down the hall, I finally admitted what I'd known since that night at Miller's Lake 20 years earlier. What I'd known in my bones, even as I'd convinced myself it was something else, something safer and more explicable. I was in love with Julian. Had been in love with him for more than half my life, though I'd never had the courage to call it by its name. And now he was offering me the chance to stop pretending that love was something I could outgrow, or ignore, or bury beneath the weight of the life I'd built to hide from it. The question that kept me awake until dawn wasn't whether I loved him. It was whether I was brave enough to love him out loud. The next meeting happened 3 days later. Though it felt like a lifetime had passed since I'd fled from Julian's look like a teenager running from his first glimpse of something he wasn't supposed to want. His text had been simple, just a name and an address, but I'd stared at it for an hour before responding. The yes I finally sent felt like signing my name to a document I hadn't read, agreeing to terms I didn't fully understand. This bar was different from the others, smaller and quieter, tucked into a neighborhood where the chances of running into anyone we knew dropped to nearly zero. Julian was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table that seemed deliberately chosen for its privacy. He looked up when I walked in, and his smile was gentler than I'd expected, understanding in a way that made my chest ache with gratitude and terror in equal measure. We talked around the elephant in the room at first, the way we always did. Safe topics, familiar ground. But I could feel the weight of what hadn't been said pressing down on us like storm clouds, making even ordinary conversation feel charged with electricity. Every word felt like a placeholder for something else, something neither of us was quite ready to speak aloud. I was in the middle of a story about David's latest baseball game when Julian reached across the table. Not dramatically, not with any grand gesture that might have given me time to prepare or pull away. Just a simple movement, his fingers brushing against mine where my hand rested next to my drink. The contact was brief, probably no more than a few seconds, but it sent a shock through my entire nervous system like touching a live wire. Neither of us pulled away. That was the thing that undid me completely. I'd been braced for retreat, for the quick embarrassment of accidental contact followed by careful distance. Instead, Julian's fingers lingered against mine, warm and deliberate, while the conversation died in my throat and the world narrowed to that small point of connection between us. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thunderous, full of everything we'd been dancing around for weeks. Every truth we'd dressed up as nostalgia or coincidence or the natural affection between old friends. In that silence, pretense became impossible. Julian's thumb brushed across my knuckles, and I felt something inside me crack open like an eggshell, spilling out feelings I'd kept locked away for so long I'd almost convinced myself they didn't exist. When Julian finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the quiet like a blade through silk. "You know, don't you?" he said, and the question hit me like a physical blow. Not because I didn't understand what he meant, but because I understood it so completely, so immediately, that it felt like he'd reached inside my chest and spoken directly to my heart. I felt my chest collapse and expand all at once, like someone had knocked the wind out of me and given me my first real breath simultaneously. The careful architecture I'd built around this secret, the elaborate structure of denial and deflection I'd maintained for 20 years, crumbled in the space of those 4 words. Of course I knew. I'd always known. I'd just never been brave enough to say it out loud, even to myself. The rest of our time in the bar passed in a blur of careful conversation and stolen glances. We both seemed to understand that something irreversible had happened, that we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But we also seemed to know that this wasn't the place for whatever came next. The revelation hung between us like a bridge we weren't quite ready to step onto, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. When Julian suggested we get some air, I followed him outside without question. The night was cool and clear, the kind of spring evening that makes you remember why you love the season. The street was quiet, just a few parked cars and the distant hum of traffic from busier roads. We walked without direction, side by side but not touching, until we found ourselves in the shadow of an old oak tree that seemed to exist specifically to provide privacy for conversations that couldn't happen in brighter places. Julian stopped walking and turned to face me, and I saw in his expression everything I'd been too afraid to hope for and too terrified to imagine. The careful distance he'd maintained, the way he'd let me set the pace of our meetings, the patience with which he'd waited for me to catch up to what he'd probably known all along. He'd been protecting me from my own fear, giving me time to find my way to this moment without pressure, without demands. When he stepped closer, I didn't retreat. When he reached up to touch my face, his fingers gentle against my cheek, I leaned into the contact instead of pulling away. And when he kissed me, finally, after 20 years of wondering and wanting and pretending I didn't, I kissed him back with 20 years of suppressed longing. It was hesitant at first, careful, both of us aware that this was new territory despite the history we shared. But it was also inevitable, like something that had been building toward this moment for decades. The kiss lasted maybe 10 seconds, maybe forever. Time seemed to bend around us, making the moment both impossibly brief and endlessly long. When we broke apart, I felt like I'd been turned inside out and reassembled differently. Every nerve ending in my body was alive with sensation. Every breath felt like a gift I hadn't known I'd been missing. Julian's eyes searched my face for signs of regret or panic, but all I could feel was a startling sense of rightness, like I'd finally stepped into my own skin after years of wearing someone else's. The walk back to our cars was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than we'd shared before. Not the weighted quiet of things unsaid, but the peaceful pause that comes after a truth has been acknowledged. Julian squeezed my hand once before we separated, a gesture so simple and so profound that it made my eyes water. The drive home was a study in contradictions. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, but my heart felt steadier than it had in years. I was terrified of what I'd just done, of what it meant for my marriage and my children and the carefully ordered life I'd spent 15 years building. But I was also more alive than I'd felt since I couldn't remember when, buzzing with the kind of electric energy that comes from finally being honest about who you are. At red lights, I caught glimpses of myself in the rearview mirror and saw a stranger there. Same face, same hair that was starting to gray at the temples, same eyes that had looked back at me from mirrors for 36 years. But something fundamental had shifted behind those eyes. Some essential truth had been acknowledged that changed everything about how I looked at the world and my place in it. This wasn't just about Julian. though he was the catalyst that had finally cracked me open. This was about me, about the realization that I'd been living inside a life that fit like a costume I'd never been comfortable wearing. I thought about all the times I'd watched other men a beat too long, all the moments of connection I'd dismissed as friendship or admiration or anything other than what they really were. I thought about the way I'd felt around Julian since high school, the way my pulse quickened when he smiled, the way I'd always found excuses to be near him. I'd always known. Some part of me had always known. But knowing something and having the courage to name it, to claim it, to let it reshape your understanding of yourself, those were entirely different things. For 20 years, I'd been living with a truth I'd refused to acknowledge, carrying it like a stone in my chest while I built a life designed to prove it wasn't there. But it had been there all along, patient and persistent, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And now that it had, now that I'd kissed Julian under that oak tree and felt the world reorganize itself around that single point of contact, I couldn't pretend anymore. Couldn't go back to sleepwalking through a life that had never fit me properly. I was terrified, yes. Terrified of hurting Vanessa and the kids. Terrified of dismantling the only adult life I'd ever known. Terrified of what it would mean to live authentically after so many years of careful performance. But underneath the terror was something else, something I'd almost forgotten how to feel. Relief. Pure, overwhelming relief at finally being honest with myself about who I was and what I wanted. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like I was driving towards something instead of away from it. Living with the truth was like carrying a live wire in my chest. Every interaction with Vanessa became a performance I could barely sustain. Every family dinner a carefully choreographed dance around the bomb that was ticking louder with each passing day. The kiss had changed something fundamental in me, not just how I saw myself, but how I moved through the world, and apparently it showed in ways I couldn't control. Vanessa noticed first in small things. The way I'd started checking my phone more frequently, the distracted quality that crept into my voice when she asked about my day. But as the days passed, her questions grew sharper, more pointed, like a detective gathering evidence for a case she didn't want to have to make. "You've been different lately," she said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. The kids were upstairs doing homework, their voices carrying down through the ceiling in the familiar rhythm of sibling bickering and negotiation. She didn't look at me as she spoke, focusing instead on loading the dishwasher with the mechanical precision of someone who'd performed this task thousands of times. I mumbled something about work stress, the same excuse I'd been using for weeks. But Vanessa paused, her hands still gripping a plate, and I saw her shoulders tense in a way that told me she wasn't buying it anymore. "Where do you go at night?" she asked quietly, and the question hit me like a physical blow. There was no accusation in her tone, just exhaustion, the weariness of someone who'd been trying to ignore an obvious truth until she couldn't anymore. "Who are you with?" The words hung in the air between us, impossible to deflect or dismiss. I opened my mouth to offer another lie, another comfortable fiction about client dinners and work obligations, but nothing came. The machinery of deception I'd been operating for weeks suddenly felt too heavy to lift, too complex to manage. I could see her reflection in the kitchen window, her face pale and resigned in the glass. She already knew something was wrong, had probably known for longer than I'd realized. The only question was whether I had the courage to tell her the truth, or if I'd keep feeding her carefully measured lies until the weight of them crushed whatever was left of our marriage. That night, lying in bed with the familiar space between our bodies that had somehow become a canyon, I felt the walls closing in. Vanessa's breathing was too controlled to be natural sleep, and I knew she was lying awake just as I was, both of us trapped in our separate silences. The truth pressed against my ribs like a caged bird, demanding to be let out. It was Julian who finally gave me the courage to speak, though not in the way I'd expected. We'd met for coffee instead of drinks, a concession to the growing difficulty of explaining evening absences. The afternoon lights streaming through the cafe windows felt too bright for the conversation we needed to have, too cheerful for the weight of what we were navigating. "You look terrible," he said, and his concern was so genuine it made my chest ache. When was the last time you slept? I told him about Vanessa's questions, about the growing tension at home, about the way I felt like I was drowning in my own deception. Julian listened without judgment, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup like he was trying to absorb its warmth. You don't have to burn everything down overnight, he said finally. We can take this slow, figure it out as we go. You don't owe anyone a complete explanation until you're ready to give one. But even as he spoke, I knew he was wrong. Not intentionally, not because he didn't understand the situation, but because he couldn't feel what I felt every time I looked at Vanessa and saw the questions she was too kind to ask directly. Time itself had become a lie I could no longer sustain. Every day I waited was another day of building a house of cards that was bound to collapse eventually. The confrontation came 3 nights later, sudden and inevitable as a summer storm. I'd been later than usual getting home from meeting Julian, and Vanessa was waiting for me in the living room when I walked through the door. She wasn't pretending to read or watch television, wasn't maintaining any of the comfortable fictions we'd both relied on for weeks. She was simply sitting in the chair by the window, hands folded in her lap, looking like someone who'd finally run out of patience. We need to talk, she said, and her voice was steady in a way that scared me more than anger would have. I need you to tell me what's going on. I sat down across from her, my hands shaking in a way I couldn't control. The living room suddenly felt like a courtroom, every familiar object transformed into evidence of the life I was about to implode. Family photos on the mantel, Emma's piano book stacked on the coffee table, David's baseball trophy catching light from the lamp we'd bought for our first apartment. I told her part of the truth. Not everything. Not yet, but enough. I told her about the meetings with Julian, about the feelings I'd been carrying since high school, about the realization that I'd been living as someone I wasn't for longer than I could remember. The words came out broken and stammering, years of suppressed honesty spilling out in fragments that didn't quite form a complete picture but painted enough of one for her to understand. Vanessa listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each confession. When I finally stopped talking, when the words ran out and left us sitting in the wreckage of what I'd just admitted, the silence that followed was colder than any anger I'd ever experienced. She didn't yell or cry or throw things, which somehow made it worse. She just sat there, absorbing what I'd told her, and I watched 15 years of marriage reorganize themselves in her mind. I saw her remembering moments that probably made sense now in ways they hadn't before, saw her understanding things about our relationship that she'd never had the context to recognize. How long? She asked finally, and I knew she wasn't just asking about Julian. Always, I whispered, and the admission felt like jumping off a cliff. I think I've always known, but I was too afraid to face it. She nodded like this confirmed something she'd suspected, and that small gesture broke my heart more than any accusation could have. She'd been living with someone who was fundamentally dishonest about who he was, and she'd probably felt it even when she couldn't name it. Over the next few days, the house became a minefield of careful conversations and loaded silences. We maintained normal routines for the children's sake, but underneath the surface, everything had changed. Vanessa moved through our home like a guest in a place she no longer recognized, while I felt like an imposter who'd finally been caught. Julian called and texted, but I couldn't find words to explain what was happening. How do you tell someone that loving them has set fire to the only life you've ever known? That the truth you'd waited 20 years to speak has turned your house into a museum of everything you're about to lose? The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when I couldn't bear the weight anymore. The kids were asleep. Vanessa had retreated to her sister's for the night, and I was alone in a house that felt like it belonged to someone else. Without making a conscious decision, I found myself in the car, driving through streets I knew by heart toward an apartment I'd never seen, but whose address was burned into my memory. Julian lived in a converted warehouse downtown, the kind of building that attracted artists and writers and people who'd made different choices than I had. I sat in my car across the street, staring up at the light in his window, my wedding ring suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds on my finger. I knew he was up there waiting, though we'd made no plans to meet. Somehow I knew he'd been waiting since the night we kissed, patient and understanding and ready to catch me when I finally fell. Not asking for promises I couldn't make, not demanding explanations for choices I hadn't figured out how to choose. Just waiting, the way he'd been waiting for 20 years, for me to find the courage to be honest about who I was and what I wanted. The choice pressed in around me like water, inescapable and absolute. I could start the car and drive home, slip back into the house like a thief and pretend this night had never happened. Try to rebuild some version of the life I'd been living, find a way to stuff the truth back into the box where I'd kept it hidden for so long. Return to the safety of silence and the slow suffocation of living someone else's life. Or I could get out of the car and walk across the street and finally choose myself. Choose the terrifying clarity of truth over the comfortable numbness of pretense. Choose love over fear, authenticity over security, the person I really was over the person I'd taught myself to be. I sat there for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel, watching Julian's window and feeling the weight of every choice I'd ever made and all the ones I still had to make. In that moment, suspended between my past and my future, I understood that this was what courage actually felt like. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to step forward despite being absolutely terrified of what came next. The light in Julian's window remained steady, patient as sunrise, waiting for me to decide. I don't remember making the decision to get out of the car. One moment I was gripping the steering wheel, suspended between two versions of my life, and the next I was standing on Julian's doorstep with my finger hovering over the buzzer. My wedding ring caught the light from the hallway, gold gleaming like an accusation, and I almost turned around 3 times before finally pressing the button. Julian's voice through the intercom was unsurprised, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Come up," he said simply, and the door buzzed open with a sound that felt like crossing a threshold I'd never be able to uncross. The elevator ride to the 4th floor lasted forever and no time at all. I caught my reflection in the polished metal doors and saw a man I barely recognized, someone who looked simultaneously terrified and more alive than he'd been in years. When the doors opened, Julian was waiting in his doorway, and the sight of him made my chest ache with gratitude and fear and 20 years of suppressed longing. We didn't speak immediately. He stepped back to let me into his apartment, and I found myself in a space that felt like everything my own home wasn't. Books everywhere, art on the walls chosen for love rather than decoration, furniture that looked lived in rather than carefully arranged for appearances. It felt like a place where someone actually lived instead of performed living. Julian offered me a drink, but I shook my head. Alcohol felt wrong for this moment, too much like the crutch I'd been using to get through our previous meetings. This needed to happen with complete clarity, no substances to soften the edges or provide excuses for choices I needed to own completely. We talked quietly, not about the future or what any of this meant, but about the immediate present. The apartment, the late hour, the strangeness of finally being in the same space without the neutral territory of bars and coffee shops between us. Our conversation felt different here, more intimate, like we'd stepped inside something that had been circling us for weeks. When he kissed me again, it was different from that first time under the oak tree. Less hesitant, more certain, as if we'd both finally stopped questioning whether this was something we were allowed to want. I kissed him back with 20 years of honesty I'd never been brave enough to offer anyone, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. What happened after felt both inevitable and miraculous. Not just the physical intimacy, though that was revelation enough, but the emotional nakedness that came with finally being completely honest with another person about who I was. With Julian, I didn't have to perform or pretend or carefully measure my responses. I could just be, fully and without apology, the person I'd never had the courage to be with anyone else. Afterward, lying in the darkness of his bedroom with morning still hours away, we talked in whispers about everything and nothing. Julian traced patterns on my shoulder with his finger while I told him things I'd never spoken aloud, fears and dreams and truths I'd kept locked away for so long I'd almost forgotten they were there. He listened without judgment, without trying to fix or solve anything, just witnessing me in a way that felt sacred. But even in that perfect quiet, reality pressed at the edges. My phone, face down on the nightstand, held messages I wasn't ready to read. My house across town sat empty except for the ghosts of the life I'd built there. Vanessa was probably at her sister's, maybe crying, maybe angry, maybe just numb with the understanding that her marriage had been slowly dying for years without either of us knowing how to name what was wrong. The wedding ring felt impossible on my finger, a piece of metal that had somehow become heavier than gravity. I slipped it off without thinking, my hands shaking as I set it on Julian's nightstand. The pale band of skin underneath looked foreign, like I was seeing my own hand for the first time. Julian noticed, but didn't comment, just reached over to squeeze my fingers where the ring had been. The gesture was so gentle, so understanding of what that small act had cost me, that I almost started crying. Not from sadness, but from relief, so overwhelming it felt like drowning in reverse, like surfacing after years underwater. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was, and then it all came rushing back. The choice, the apartment, the ring sitting on the nightstand like evidence of a crime I'd finally had the courage to commit. Julian was already up, moving around his kitchen with quiet efficiency. He'd put on clothes, but I could tell he'd been trying not to wake me, moving carefully in deference to what had to be the most important sleep I'd gotten in months. When he saw me stirring, he smiled with a tenderness that made my chest tight. He brought me coffee in a mug that was probably older than my children, ceramic worn smooth by countless mornings. Our shoulders brushed as he sat down beside me on the couch, and the casual intimacy of it felt both natural and revolutionary. How long had it been since simple touch felt like nourishment instead of obligation? We didn't talk about what came next. Not the practical details of divorce or custody or the thousand small destructions that would be required to dismantle the life I'd built. Not the conversations I'd have to have or the confessions I'd need to make or the ways this choice would ripple out into every corner of my existence. Those storms were coming, inevitable as weather, but they belonged to tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. This morning belonged to something else. To breathing fully for the first time in years, to the simple miracle of sitting beside someone who knew exactly who I was and wanted me anyway. To the fragile truth of two men standing in the wreckage of silence, finally facing each other honestly. I found myself at Julian's window, looking down at the morning streets below. Early commuters hurried past, caught up in the familiar rhythms of their own carefully constructed lives. I wondered how many of them were carrying secrets like the one I'd finally set down, how many were living inside costumes that no longer fit. The faint outline of my wedding ring was still visible on my finger, a pale reminder of the man I'd been when I woke up yesterday. But that man felt like a stranger now, someone I'd outgrown so completely I could barely remember what it felt like to be him. I'd chosen the dare, finally, after 20 years of pretending I didn't hear the question. I'd chosen truth over safety, love over fear, the terrifying freedom of being myself over the comfortable prison of being who I thought I was supposed to be. Julian joined me at the window, his warmth solid and reassuring at my back. He didn't ask what I was thinking or push for declarations about the future. He just stood with me as the city woke up below us, patient as he'd always been, letting me find my way to whatever came next. The real challenge was only just beginning. I knew that, but for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was looking forward to meeting it as myself instead of as someone I pretended to be. Whatever came next, I'd face it with lungs that could finally fill completely, with a heart that had remembered how to beat honestly, with the quiet certainty that I'd finally found the courage to live inside my own life instead of watching it happen to someone else. The morning stretched ahead of us, full of possibility and consequence in equal measure, and I was ready for all of it.